Tonight, Parliament will be voting on a bill which compels Boris Johnson to ask for an extension to Article 50. It looks certain to pass. Yesterday, in the space of a few hours, Johnson managed to go from a majority of 1 to a majority of minus 43. I've got the sound on my laptop, which I'm going to have to turn off very quickly here. Incredibly unprofessional from myself there. Now it looks like Johnson's plan B, a People versus Parliament general election, has been blocked. And Johnson's first performance at Prime Minister's Question today has been almost universally panned, short on substance, strong on awful jokes. At one point he called Jeremy Corbyn a chlorinated chicken. I don't know why you'd want to bring up that when you're the one associated with a trade deal with Donald Trump. In any case, the question of tonight's show, has Boris Johnson fucked it? And to answer that question, I'm joined by James Meadway, ex-advisor to John McDonnell, lefty economist and very good friend of the show.
Good evening.
Have you been enjoying watching the supposedly genius strategy of Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson explode in their well-healed but badly moisturised faces?
It's been very lovely. It's been very satisfying indeed. I mean, it seems like every Tory Prime Minister has this sort of consigliere, this Machiavellian genius somewhere behind them. You know, so you got Nick Timothy with Theresa May, Steve Hilton with David Cameron, and like the period of time which they have some contact with reality, right? And it all sort of explodes horribly, as you said, in their faces. It seems to be reducing every single time. I mean, it took the 2017 election campaign for the Nick Timothy wheels to come off. Steve Hilton probably got as far as like the referendum or something, maybe a bit earlier than that. He decided to disappear to California. A bit longer to go. This time round, you got I've forgotten the guy's name. You see, I'm forgetting him already. Dominic Cummings. Brought in this kind of evil mastermind who supposedly managed to get the entire country to vote leave. This is, half the country, 52% of the country. This is nonsense, by the way. I mean, this is like a really sort of deep misunderstanding of why the leave vote happened. The fundamental of why the leave vote happened, why it tipped over the line towards 52%, is that this is a country that's been deeply messed up for a long period of time. There's a lot of people very unhappy about it, and they were given an opportunity to express that. It doesn't require some evil genius to turn what would otherwise be a lovely, happy 2012 Olympics place into somewhere that votes to leave the EU because they're kind of pissed off. Right? This is a mythology. And frankly, looking at the front pages over the last sort of few weeks, Dominic Cummings, at the very least, is quite good at getting himself publicity. Turns out he's not so good at actually running a strategy that gets the government where it wants to get to. And we're not looking at this point in time as some mega genius like 5D chess that this is all part of some cunning plan. The wheels have come off in spectacular style. You could almost see the moment where it wasn't working, which I think was Wednesday when Boris Johnson was trying to do his Theresa May Mark II speech outside number 10 Downing Street and was visibly rattled by the sounds of protesters outside. That was the exact moment where you knew that this one wasn't working. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to claw their way back one way or another over the next few weeks and months, however long this takes. But I think if you step back a bit, like the big picture here is something quite extraordinary or terrifying, which is that it's not going to happen just yet, but we could be looking at a situation where the Conservative Party is basically finished as a political force in Britain. And that's one outcome. The outcome that they want, the leadership of the Conservative Party, is to effectively finish socialism as a political force in Britain, right? And these are the two things, and these are the two great irreconcilables. And how that plays out is the big sort of pattern behind all the parliamentary drama and potentially the election campaign that we're going to end up in, presumably fairly shortly, because there's no majority in Parliament to get anything done. So that's the kind of really big sort of scene-setting part of it, and it will be the next few years that decide that one way or other. The entire future of the country hinges on that question and where the thing lands, I think.
You're going for socialism or barbarism?
Yeah, it's basically socialism or barbarism. Yeah, that's almost literally. That
second part, actually, of it, I mean, I know that people often talk about how Boris Johnson's strategy here is to refashion the Tory party basically as a nationalist, slightly less economically liberal force, potentially. Less often it's sort of projected as a project to destroy socialism for a generation. I mean, what do you mean by that? Precisely.
Well, look, it's Boris Johnson, right? So he says all sorts of things, and you can take it seriously or not. But if you look during his election campaign over the summer, the two things he says: one, I will deliver Brexit, see how that's going, and two, I'm going to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. Right, I'm the person to do this, and that's what he's campaigning on. That's what he intends to do, and his strategy to do that is to basically use one to do the other: deliver Brexit, destroy Jeremy Corbyn, therefore destroy socialism. All good. The actuality of what he's doing, and this is really striking, is his strategy, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, is basically Theresa May's, but done with a bit more vigour, shall we say? I mean, that's being polite about the kind of manoeuvres and the playing fast and loose with the constitution and basic sort of democratic norms we've seen in the last week or so. So it's Theresa May's strategy, which is Nick Timothy's strategy, which is to say, okay, we're going to reconstruct conservatism on a sort of national conservative basis, you might call it. There's better examples in Europe. It's not really something we're familiar with here, although after a few years of this, we ought to be. Law and Justice Party, right? It's a sort of national conservative. It's actually quite interventionist in Poland. Economically interventionist, deeply socially conservative, also racist. So it's that kind of model of conservatism where you say, free market, whatever, we're here to sort of paternalism, really. We're going to stick up for British industry. We're going to intervene. We're going to have an industrial strategy. We're going to spend a bit more money. Austerity's over. We're going to deal with what Theresa May called the burning injustices. Now, all right, Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson don't really care that much about burning injustices, but they do have a sense that they need to do something like this to try and make conservatism work. And that is where they're trying to get to in this one. Theresa May, I think it went wrong for her. And we shouldn't forget, actually, she did, like, the vote that they got, it nearly worked. This strategy nearly worked, right? In 2017, the Conservatives got the biggest share of their votes since 1983 under Margaret Thatcher. Had it not been for the Labour surge, they would be looking at a thumping great majority.
And she would have passed a withdrawal agreement and everything would have looked hunky-dory.
Everything by this point would have looked absolutely fine for them, and socialism would have been wiped out for a generation or longer in this country. So that's what they tried to get to, and we disrupted them. The fundamental bit about disrupting it, and this I think Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings do have a sense of, which is why the spending round today was important to them, was that if you talk about ending austerity, you kind of have to actually end austerity. Like, we're in a world where the 1990s rules of politics that it's all about comms, it's all about communication. It doesn't really matter what you're saying as long as you say it in a slick, centralised fashion. It's media management and message discipline, and back in the olden days when people had pages and this was considered this marvellous new device to tell MPs what to do, that sort of thing, right? That's the 1990s Alistair Campbell, now dead and buried model of how to do politics. The new model of politics is that your communication can actually be pretty awful one way or the other, but the policies matter. Donald Trump is not in a sense a particularly good, slick communicator. He can communicate to his base in particular, but he's not like a conventionally slick communicator. What he has is policy, and that's what cuts through. And the policy is often just totally awful and horrendous, but it's quite clear and quite simple. You know what he's going to do. He's going to build a wall, right? Or if he goes and campaigns, I've got friends who live in Michigan who told me he was doing this. He goes and campaigns in Michigan. He turns up somewhere where they've never seen a presidential candidate for like 30 years and says, hey, that bridge you want built, I'm going to build that bridge, right? You deliver something, you do the policy. So Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson grasp that. They also are not hidebound by the standard Tory thing of thinking that, you have to raise taxes to pay for stuff. They'll just pay for stuff if they have to, so they'll just do that.
It's kind of a more Republican model of doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
It's just like, just get out there and spend, and they'll spend what it takes to get through that. So they have to deliver the policy. So they say austerity's ended, and they want to be able to say austerity's ending. They want to be able to point at something. Hence the spending round today. Hence the row, and it's been quite a serious one that we've only seen parts of between Number 10 and the Treasury. So when you tell Sajid Javid that, no, you can't do your big announcement last week, it has to be this week, you just cancel it unilaterally as Number 10. You then sack, in fairly sort of brutal, unpleasant fashion, his senior media advisor, his senior comms person, like 4 or 5 days before he's due to do this big rescheduled speech. I mean, this is just like, that is taking back control of the Treasury in a big way at that point. And
do you think that's what that was about?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, completely.
So it wasn't about, because there's been sort of rumours that it was about Dominic Cummings being suspicious that she'd leaked something to someone, and he got a frog marched out of Number 10 after firing it.
Okay, like that's Dominic Cummings' personal sort of failures as a manager, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're seeing there. It's just unpleasant. The issue here is to get control of the Treasury. Right, that's what they tried to do. That's what they want Sajid Javid to stand there and say. John McDonnell, in his response, referred to this today. That Dominic Cummings, he made a joke about him writing the speech that he'd just seen. That's what they want to do. They have to deliver the spending. So they have to be able to say that, look, we've now got £13.8 billion of new spending coming forward. No government department, he ended on this point, Sajid Javid today, no government department will face cuts from next year. So that they can say austerity's over. Right? Now, the difficulty with them doing this is that they are still sitting inside their existing fiscal rules. They're still sitting inside the rules that they inherited from Philip Hammond that tell them how much they can spend depending on how big the deficit is and what's happening to government debt. They've managed to jam...
And those, just to be clear, those fiscal rules are that deficits can never be bigger than 2% of GDP.
Yeah, deficit has to be below 2% of GDP. And debt, which is the total amount of government borrowing over time, the deficit is the difference between taxes and spending, right? So you have a deficit if your spending is more than your taxes. At the minute, it's, 1.8, 1.2% GDP, something around that. So that gives them a bit of room relative to their own rule. And so they go out and spend it. Now, the slightly sneaky bit there is they're using the old forecast to do that. So in other words, when the economy looks slightly better early in the year, rather than as potentially, possibly not, but potentially going to a recession like it is now, use the old forecast. It gives you about 15 billion pounds to spend, of which they spent about 13.8 billion on their priorities. So police, education, health, that sort of thing, carefully targeted, and then they can say we're ending austerity and look like you're delivering something. And that's the difference to Theresa May. Otherwise, the strategy looks extraordinarily similar. Right, it's deliver Brexit, talk about intervention, talk about ending austerity. Their one is like, we're also going to try and deliver this.
I mean, the way that the strategy, I think, in the mind of Dominic Cummings and what it looked like, and I think actually, what they planned to do that was different to what Theresa May did, is that she hoped that she could run down the clock whilst Parliament was sitting, and that basically she could kind of manage that and get people down to close to the 29th of March and then hold a gun against their head and say it's my deal or no deal. What Boris Johnson seems to have understood is that what drained the energy from the May administration was the fact that that Parliament was sitting this whole time, passing various pieces of legislation that reduced her room for manoeuvre until the deadline was extended and then she was left as a sort of lame duck. And what Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson decided to do is we're not going to let that happen. Yep. We're not going to let the energy be drained from us in Parliament whilst we're running down the clock. We're going to run down the clock in a manner whereby... in a manner that's very dramatic and constantly dramatic. Yes. The May administration was incredibly boring. That's what everyone said about it. All commentators like, we're reporting on exactly the same thing over and over again. And what it made her look like was a boring failure. Yeah. And I think what Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings came in and said, we're decisive. We're going to give you exciting politics. We're going to get rid of the MPs. We're going to... I mean, potentially they were just running down the clock to get something, like you say, that looked a bit like May's deal, but with 2 weeks to go until there was genuinely going to be deal or no deal because an extension was off the table. But it has failed. Well, I mean, actually, we don't know. Do you think it has failed?
We don't know it's failed yet. Let's not get too excited about this one. Choices a boring failure or an exciting failure. Well, we're not quite there as an exciting failure yet. He is still Prime Minister. They are, as we've seen this evening, thinking of all sorts of chicanery and trickery to try and stay where they are. Things haven't landed necessarily. Everything's to play for. Things have not landed decisively one way or the other in this sort of short period of time that we're in at the minute. But it is to run down the clock. I mean, wasn't that the lead? This is the Telegraph splash, the big report yesterday with direct quotes on this is running down the clock. This is the whole thing's a sham. All that sort of stuff.
The thing that was a sham there was the negotiations with the EU, right?
Yeah, that's
so they're saying they need this time and they need this bargaining power with the EU to get to remove the backstop, I suppose. Yeah. Whereas what you think they're going to do, or what they're trying to do, or what the original plan was to run down the clock, basically come back with May's deal. Yeah. With the backstop?
They'll have the backstop. The backstop is immovable. I can't see any set of circumstances at all where the EU remove the backstop. Why would they? The Ireland has said very, very clearly, and this is well understood, that the backstop is essential because you can't have a hard border. That is kind of fundamental to what they want out of this. There is no point being an EU member if the EU itself can't defend you on a point like this, right? So they have to do this. They have to stick to the backstop. They will not budge on this. Any changes to it will be utterly cosmetic. The strategy that you've got is, from number 10, is run down the clock, shorten the time as much as possible, frighten everyone into having to vote for what is basically going to be May's deal, because that's the only thing on the table, and there's no real amendments available to it. There's a wing of the Tory party who've kind of changed their opinion around this. Their original thinking was, the sort of ERG end of things, was to sort of say that, oh God, this is just a disastrous deal, we're going to vote against it, we're going to get something better. What they've kind of swung round to now is saying, actually, we can kind of pick away at some of the stuff we don't like, right? We can get this deal through and then start to pick away on the outline political declaration in particular. That's why May, on the third time round, wanted to separate the two things. So there's details in the outline political declaration around Britain will continue to observe basically EU food regulations. Now, you can't sign a big free trade deal with the US with lots and lots of exciting things about getting all their lovely chlorinated chicken or whatever it might be. If you're saying we will have a deal with
so that's
the
what
EU.
the ERG wanted to take up.
Yeah. So they want to pick away all this stuff, get the withdrawal agreement through, pick away all the rest of it, and then we'll see where we get to. The only bit that doesn't work there is the backstop because it's part of the withdrawal agreement, so they get quite het up about that. But if you look at Boris Johnson's cabinet, this is not a cabinet that's just going to go all out for no deal. I think almost every single person in it, with the exception of Priti Patel, voted at some point for Theresa May's deal. Right, so they've already voted for this thing. They'll vote for it again at some point, and that's where they're going to end up. It's like, I think it's a mistake to just assume that Boris Johnson wants a no-deal Brexit. Right, this is a ploy. He'll do it if he has to, like, and quite possibly the way that Theresa May maybe wouldn't have done, but he'll do it if he has to. But it's not where he wants to get to. And he'll do it if he has to, if it's what keeps the Tory party together. Now, that already looks like it's shot to pieces on the current evidence. So he's left with this thing just as a threat. Run down the clock, frighten MPs, frighten everybody, then you get the thing through.
Mm-hmm. What did you think about, I don't know if you read this article, it was back in July actually by Tom Kabassi, who was arguing that a potential option is to get rid of the withdrawal agreement, run down the clock, genuinely scare the EU into offering some sort of compromise, which was basically that we'd leave the political union but stay in the economic union whilst we're negotiating a free trade deal, which in a sort of smart way, without officially removing the backstop from the withdrawal agreement, would have meant we've left the EU without a backstop.
Something like that is about the only possible variation that I can see.
That would be their strategy succeeding, right?
Yeah. So, and Johnson himself referred to this during his campaign when he talked about, it was a bit confused as these things were, and probably deliberately so because he's not stupid. When he talked about extending the implementation period. Mm-hmm. So the leverage you could get, and the only bit the EU might accept, is you sort of say, well, the withdrawal agreement at the minute is 2 years. If we say, it's 5 years or 6 years or some period of time, well, you're basically still inside the EU, but the backstop isn't such a threat because it's 6 years away, 5 years away, whatever. You might be able to get some movement around that because you're not really changing the content of what you've agreed. You're just kind of dragging things out a bit. So that's just about one of the few places where you might get something meaningful. You can probably...
Which you could sell as a success, right?
Yeah, you could try to. Yeah. I mean, what it would basically mean is that you're still inside the EU, but with no say over what's happening for a long period of time, right? Which is a kind of weird form of success at that point if your aim was to leave the EU. And no doubt some of the real sort of dedicated no-deal Brexit people would object to this. But you could try and sell it to everyone as like, Brexit's out of the way, it's done, let's move on.
Anyway, in terms of... I mean, that particular scenario there was based on the idea that they could threaten the EU with a no deal. That's no longer the case. So if Boris Johnson is in power until the 31st of October, it looks like he's definitely going to have to ask for an extension unless he comes to a deal which they, is kind of their first choice, the EU's first choice. Obviously, the other option, other than Boris Johnson being held as a lame duck prime minister until the 31st of October, is we have some kind of general election. So the big story today, other than the spending review, which we just covered, and other than the legislation which we assume is going to pass to force or compel Boris Johnson to extend Article 50 if he doesn't get a deal, is the question of whether or not we will have a general election. Yeah. So yesterday, when we talked about it yesterday, the details of what legislation is what is very difficult to work out. But in any case, yesterday a bill passed which meant that today people would be debating this bill to extend Article 50. Boris Johnson, after that passed, which the government had opposed, said that what he wanted was to have a general election. Now, the opposition parties are all debating about whether this is a general election they actually want to have, and particularly when it should happen. So I want to go through some tweets about the current thinking from the Labour Party before going to you about what you think is the sensible thing to do. So originally, we can get up the Lewis Goodall tweet in a moment, but originally it seemed like Jeremy Corbyn's line, which it has been for the last 2 years, is that I want a general election as soon as possible. Bring it on. I'm ready. Then it sort of evolved slightly to a position which was, we want a general election unless what Boris Johnson is doing is tricking us. He's going to tell us we're going to have a general election on the 14th of October. Then he's actually going to move it to the 1st of November and force through a no-deal Brexit without Parliament sitting. You what, sorry? Oh, I didn't send Gary the tweets. Oh, that's a nightmare. In any case, I'll just read them to you. You can look them up yourself if you want. Right. Let me get back to where I was. But now it seems like it's not the case that Labour just want to guarantee that an election is on the 14th of October. It seems like potentially they want to have a general election after the 31st of October, basically because they think that might make Boris Johnson look bad, or because it buys them enough time to have a decent campaign. So I'll read out some of the tweets of what people's current thinking is whether or not to have a general elections. This is from Lewis Goodall earlier on Sky. So he said, I've got the wrong... Jesus. My understanding is that the strong view of Starmer, McDonnell and virtually all factions of PLP is that there shouldn't be an election before November. I'm told Starmer told PLP, which is the Parliamentary Labour Party, we need to implement the bill too, which necessarily means going beyond October. So that's the idea that you have to implement the bill as well as just passing it.
Yeah.
That was quote tweeted by Lloyd Russell Moyle, another friend of the show. I've never seen UK Labour so united. Jeremy Corbyn yesterday and today, and then John McDonnell and now Keir Starmer. We are determined not to allow Boris Johnson to trick us into a bogus election to stop the bill. We will call an election at a time of our own choosing this year. Labour Lewis, Clive Lewis, then tweeted, the sensible thing to do is to say, OK, we'll have a general election, but we'll do it after we have got the extension signed and sealed at the European Council. In the meantime, let the Tories stew in their own juices and implode. So all of this is very much suggesting that what Labour want to do is stall. They want to make sure we don't have a general election before November, because they think that puts Boris Johnson in a very awkward position. Do you think that's sensible?
Well, it's not stalling, is it? It's like it's perfectly reasonable given Boris Johnson's entire record in public life, demonstrated quite amply over the last few weeks, to say that if we simply pass a bill saying that we should have an extension and all the rest of it, the Ben bill currently under discussion in the House of Commons, it's quite reasonable to say that simply passing that and not seeing it actually brought into law and implemented is something that gives the government some space to kind of mess around. And that if you have a position, and Labour does have a position, that we absolutely do not want a no-deal Brexit, then this is the thing you rule out before you say you have a general election. That's like perfectly reasonable, sort of sensible approach to dealing with a government that is prepared to not just threaten, but will go up to and beyond a no-deal Brexit if they have to. They will do that. So that's the kind of practicalities of it. Now, the political downside of this and the political risk of this is that if you think, why is it that Boris Johnson has basically lost control of the situation? He's lost control of the situation to a large extent because he did something that seemed like quite a neat move, that seemed like a way of using the contempt, frankly, that a lot of people, perhaps most people, have for Parliament and for MPs, and the brewing contempt that people have for the entire Brexit process, and using that against Parliament and to his advantage by saying we're going to prorogue Parliament, we're just going to stop all the discussion, we're going to stop these people messing around, right? These politicians, they get in the way of what people want, which is Brexit. So you prorogue Parliament. The reason it didn't work is because although people have a contempt, I think, for Parliament, the institution as such as it is, and the MPs, and people tell you about expenses scandals and subsidised bars and all this sort of thing. And it's been building up for a long period of time, all of this, and certainly the vote to leave tapped into some of that kind of feeling, is that what people really do care about is democracy, right? So you can sort of say, Parliament, we don't like it very much, but we actually really do respect the idea of democracy and there should be a debate and all this sort of thing. And he tapped into that, and it broke out of, in a bad way for him, it broke out of a sort of purely parliamentary procedure. It suddenly turns into, actually, you've touched on a really raw nerve, quite a deep feeling in British society, a long established feeling. You can trace popular movements for democracy in Britain back for the last 300 years, all the way to the Levellers and even before that. This is something that's really quite deeply embedded, and they tripped that, and it started to send the whole thing haywire for him. That's when he started to have his authority drain away. The difficulty with what's happening in terms of the kind of parliamentary manoeuvring is that it is parliamentary manoeuvring, right? And it is things that you are doing because you want to get to a good parliamentary outcome. It's not things that you're doing because this is going to make the whole political outcome better. So there's quite a risk here. And there's quite a risk that Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, the clique hold up in number 10, might be able to sort of grab the initiative back in some form and take it back into the framing that they want, which is Parliament versus people. They slipped up in a big way. It's because, I think it's frankly because neither Dominic Cummings nor Boris Johnson really understand what a mass movement is, that how politics changes, why large numbers of people on the streets, why people protesting actually starts to change particularly in a situation like this, the space in which everybody's operating. So they don't understand that. They didn't understand that. They thought they were being clever. It looked like a really sneaky move, and it's completely blown up in their faces, and everything is unwound from there. The more that we are tied into parliamentary manoeuvring, the more that it can work for them if we're not careful. Now, obviously, it's bad if he's continually defeated, and at the minute, Boris Johnson has, 100% defeat rate as Prime Minister for every single thing that's been voted on, which is quite spectacular. And it's good that he's wandering around looking like one of the walking wounded at this point, right? That's good. I wouldn't be convinced they don't have some means to try and pull the thing back to a sort of Parliament versus people framing, although goodness knows what it might be at this point in time. The more radical end of it would be simply saying, okay, the Queen's not going to sign your bill into law, for example, which would be pretty much right up there on the list of the most dramatic things you could possibly do, but it might be, I wouldn't put it past them to be considering this as an option at this point in time.
I think what's happened is that they tried to say we will do Brexit by any means necessary. They thought that people would judge the result instead of the process. So that the most important thing out of anything was to leave on the 31st of October. I think what they have discovered is that, I mean, it might sound a bit cheesy, but I think the public don't really like bullying. And I think exactly the same thing happened with Theresa May, whereby she tried to pass her deal by saying it's my way or the highway. If you don't pass this, you're going to have disaster on your heads. And obviously, MPs are individuals with egos and pride just as big as Dominic Cummings, and they don't respond well to that. And I think that the public understand quite well that if you try and bully someone to do something, it's well within their right to say no. And I think what's been so clear here is that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have been trying to bully all the MPs to do something. And then people look at that and they think like, oh, that doesn't seem quite right. If I was being bullied like that, I would also say no. I think the danger in terms of what's coming up next is I've seen an idea amongst some people, and it's potentially motivating the Labour leadership, I don't know, which is that people will wake up on the 1st of November if they've kept Boris Johnson in power but reduced his ability or blocked his ability to leave the European Union on the 31st of October. They'll wake up, these Leavers will wake up. They don't follow politics. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at the date, 1st of November, they're going to look at the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and they're going to open their newspapers or look on the TV and say, we still haven't left the European Union. That's going to whip them up into a frenzy of anger, and they're either going to stop voting or they're going to vote for the Brexit Party. I think what that underestimates is the extent to which actually Boris Johnson's argument is almost quite strong in a way, actually, which is the reason we haven't left, is because the MPs explicitly made it impossible for us to leave and then didn't let us have a general election. So I think he's going to be able to motivate Leavers and retain basically the Brexit Party vote. I think Nigel Farage will also be sensible enough to keep his powder dry and say that I'm going to have a lot more influence over the next 5 years if Boris Johnson wins the next election. So I am going to, stand down in strategic seats, or at least not really attack the government strategy, and then obviously come back to life a year later when the actual trade deal is being negotiated. So I think basically whatever happens, the Tory party are going to be able to absorb the Leave vote very successfully, and they're going to get about a 40% vote share. I think the argument for having it in November instead of October is that it gives the Labour Party slightly longer to peel off Lib Dem voters. So at the moment, obviously, Boris Johnson's biggest hope is that the Leave vote is united whilst the Remain vote is divided. I think what we've already started to see is a process whereby the Labour Party, because they've taken a lead in the campaign against prorogation, is scooping up some Lib Dem votes. The judgment which might be being made in the leadership is that if you have an election in November, that gives us, 3 months? 2 months?
About that.
2.5 months, whatever, to have basically an informal campaign where what Labour are doing is proving to people who have sort of lost faith and gone to the Greens or the Lib Dems that they are the party that will be able to at least, if not stop Brexit, then at least represent the values of those who want to stop Brexit. And I think we'll have a very stratifying, polarised election where both parties will get about 40%. And I suppose like last time that could end up in a hung parliament, we don't know. But I think either way, that's what's going to happen. The danger that was pointed out to me by Stephen Bush, actually, is that if you go for this November strategy, because it gives you a longer election campaign, it gives you a longer informal election, is that because it's informal, because Labour will be saying, we're not going to vote for a general election until mid-October or whenever Boris Johnson has accepted the extension, that means that these 6 weeks, there won't be any of the election rules in place, which means that while we're having this 2-month informal election, Boris Johnson will have all of the newspapers on side, more money than we have, and potentially that will work in his favour. I suppose we've got people, so it could go either way. I don't know which. It's one of those situations where I think everyone who's saying November election better, October election better, no one knows, do they?
You've got to refuse the terms that are being offered, because that's kind of what they're trying to do. So you refuse the terms that are being offered. Like, this is not a parliamentary debate. This is about politics in a very wide sense. How do we break out of a framing, which you're right, the delay on any election or Brexit, whatever, on Brexit can be framed as easily by Number 10 as, I told you Parliament's trying to frustrate me, right? So now we have to sort this out. And
but Remainers will like that, because to some people, and we've seen this already, to some people it makes Jeremy Corbyn look responsible.
It'll polarise, but it's not quite clear which way it'll polarise. To who will polarise the most over a question like that, and I wouldn't bet on it not polarise. It will polarise to Labour's disadvantage if the framing sits like that. So you want?
Oh, you think it will polarise to our disadvantage?
I think it will polarise to our disadvantage if Boris Johnson can look like he's the insurgent standing up against these elite, these metropolitans, whatever they're going to call them, who are thwarting the will of the people. Yes, that will definitely polarise to Labour's disadvantage. You can't have a leader like Jeremy Corbyn who is suddenly being forced to look like the establishment, right? This is not how you win. Why did we do well in 2017? Because Jeremy Corbyn looked like he was the guy, and he is the guy who's going to stand up for people against the establishment and against the elite, and that's how we're going to get and mobilise people to vote for change, for actual change. I mean, by the way, this is back into the parliamentary thing, but there is a deep issue with having these people try and look like they're changing things. I mean, if you saw, it's a bit batting on the spending round, it was quite striking where Sajid Javid had to simultaneously say, we can give you all this money because all these other Conservative governments and chancellors did so well, so now we have loads of money to spend. But at the same time, I'm making a huge break with the past, and it's all going to be new, and it's loads of... It doesn't work, right? You can't square those two
Well, for them,
things
the
up.
break with the past is that they're leaving the European Union.
Yeah, of course. So you use Brexit as a
and they've
proxy
just kicked
for all
out
of this.
21 of their MPs, which is going to prove to some people that they are very different.
You use Brexit as a proxy for that, but the difficulty in election campaign is that people start to think about what's more than Brexit. If you can close it down entirely to just a question of Brexit, then you can try and get somewhere in that. But Jeremy Corbyn has to look like he is not the candidate of the elite and the establishment. Has to, right? This is not going to be possible to win this one otherwise. How can that happen? Well, that is why the sort of protest movements and things happening outside of Parliament are so critically important. And that's why, I mean, in the end, like in pure electoral terms, it's why it matters so much that we've got, more than 500,000 Labour Party members, and the Tories have less than 100,000 members on their side. We have more than 500,000 motivated, determined people. The Tories have less than 100,000 not particularly motivated, not particularly determined people, as far as can be told. Right? So that, not in terms of all of them being particularly active. So that is a huge advantage we have. We can look like this is a campaigning, almost insurgent force. He has to try and portray himself as that, and it's relatively easy. If you have this on your side, this big mobilisation, it's relatively easy to try and get somebody else to look like they're actually part of the establishment, particularly it's Boris Johnson, right? Because he is part of the establishment. So,
or Jacob Rees-Mogg leaning back on his green bench.
It's an absolute gift. I mean, a complete gift in terms of how you want this to be framed. And the other part of it, I think you touched on it yourself. Actually, I think there's something to be mined here. The big thing you get out of this administration is bullying from the top down. Like they bully their members of their own staff, special advisors they bully. There's accounts of him shouting at civil servants, that threatening people, if they leak anything, all sorts of terrible things. MPs going in complaining about being sworn at. You then see what he's trying to do to Parliament, which is another form of bullying. We're going to close you down. It's quite it's a defining theme, I think, that we can usefully exploit. Because you look at Jeremy Corbyn, he's many things, but one thing he isn't. He's not a bully.
Well, it's interesting you say that, actually, because I think one thing that's helpful about Boris Johnson, or the way Boris Johnson is behaving, is that what the media managed to do for about 2 years was, they started off in 2015 saying he's a lovely man with quite nice politics, but he's useless.
Yep.
Then over a period of about 4 years, they went to the position of, actually, he's the devil incarnate. He's surrounded by bullies. They're racists. They're manipulative. They're opportunistic. And I mean, obviously, most of this was based on stories which are complete bullshit. But now you've got Boris Johnson there, and people are like, wait a minute, were we supposed to believe that guy, Jeremy Corbyn, was the bully? Because that doesn't seem very plausible now you've put you put this Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings guy next to him.
And wasn't it a great question from he's a new MP, isn't he? He's quite new. New MP for Slough Tandesi today at Prime Minister's Question Time, raising and somebody had to say it, and he was best to say it like in that form, in the way he said it. It was absolutely fantastic. And the shoddy response, of course, that Boris Johnson gave to the question specifically of his own personal racism directed against Muslim women. It was very, very good and very right and appropriate to raise that. And it's absolutely, it's disgraceful that he's not apologising, saying nothing at all about his own previous actions there. But it adds up. It adds up to like, this is quite an unpleasant administration. It's bullying. It happily uses racism. We've seen that happening. And if you're attacking Jeremy Corbyn is meant to look something silver, I'm sorry, this just isn't going to stick anymore when you've got behaviour like this that everybody knows about.
Okay, in a moment we're going to cover briefly what you think Labour's Brexit position should be, because I think on the one hand I feel like you lean towards Remain, but then also that what you were just saying about it's so important that we don't seem like a party in favour of the establishment. There might be a tension there. We're also going to talk about whether bankers prefer Jeremy Corbyn or a no deal. But first of all, you're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tysky Sour. As you know, this show, this channel, this organisation is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and make a donation of the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. You can also make one-off donations. We quite want to move studio soon because we're pretty worried that a general election is going to happen soon and we want to increase capacity. So any one-off donations would be very welcome. Yesterday, our audience were incredibly generous in the super chat. So if you feel so inclined today, we would love you to put your cash in our proverbial underwear in the YouTube comments. It will all go on something. Well, it will go on a new studio, fundamentally. And I'm going to take your questions, obviously, at the end of the show, as ever. So first of all, let's be very explicit. What do you think Labour's position should be in Brexit in the general election? I mean, it's going to come in the next 2 or 3 months, isn't it?
Well, it should be roughly what it is now, frankly. I think it's got to the point where it was always likely to get to. The issue that you have is that any general election before Brexit, but once a Brexit deal is on the table. So really, as soon as the draft withdrawal agreement was leaked last summer, you could see that this process was going to happen where you get a polarisation around the question of Brexit. Because suddenly you know what Brexit looks like. 2017, it's just Brexit. It could be, it's some big, vague thing that might happen, might not, whatever. And you can talk about loads and loads of other things. So it wasn't possible. For the Tories wanted it polarised on Brexit. It didn't really polarise around the question of Brexit. Once there is a withdrawal agreement on the table and Brexit can happen, and this is what it looks like, you are going to get a situation of polarisation for or against that specific form of Brexit, because this is what it's going to be. Right? You can eventually sort of try and rewrite it. If you're in government and you're Labour, you could try and get a different deal, all sorts of things. But really, at the minute, it's this. So you have an election that polarises around that question. And if the Tories are going to go to leave, then you're kind of going to end up in a Remain position, and that's where you're going to stay. If that happens, it is absolutely critical that you do not look like you're also the party of continuity and change and any other continuity on any other part of what you might do in government. Right? It is critical that you drive hard at saying we are going to change how this economy works. We're going to transform great swathes of the country, right? There've been
radical transformation in every sphere of life, apart from our trading relationships with the European Union.
That you parody it slightly, but yes,
no, I think that's actually quite a good.
Yes, basically, yeah, right. That we are going to change all the things that really do need urgently changing. It is investment across the whole country, something Sajid Javid tries to talk about today. We haven't seen the plans. They're producing their infrastructure document later in the year. So investment across the whole country, an end to austerity, and I think, given that the government is trying to say it's ending austerity and has now stumped up at least some money, so it's sort of not obvious nonsense, it'll be a while before you see much impact from this, but it's there. Moving on to a wider economic agenda, which I think is going to has to look like climate change. 85% of people seriously concerned about this, and what gets called in wonk speak the sort of ownership agenda, but it's what the Financial Times headline saying, £300 billion transfer of shares to workers under Labour. Now that, to me, that is something the Tories can't ever get to. They're not going to start talking about seriously changing how productive assets are owned in this country. Once upon a time, Thatcher talked about everybody owning shares. It never really happened. It was nonsense. It didn't happen because Thatcher wasn't going to be there literally saying to companies, you will have to give shares to this collective pot that the workers in your company will own and hold, and gradually will end up with a collective ownership of that company. Labour will do that, and that is going to be worth large amounts of money to people who have a share as a worker in that pot, right? This is going to change how British capitalism is structured, and it's going to lead to, at the minute, well, £500 a year from the dividends you get out of that. So that's quite a critical, important part of what we do, taking the economic argument to somewhere else and making it look radical and credible, and it's going to deliver something for people, for people out there who can see straight away what kind of society and economy you're going to build out of this. But we have to do that, right? And it becomes more critical to do that the more you end up taking basically a Remain position.
Yeah. I mean, and to dwell on the Remain question, like in terms of the precise what should be in the manifesto or whatever,
Yeah.
you said sort of like Labour have arrived at the correct position-ish. I mean, for me, it still looks a bit, because their position at the moment, which comes across as, I don't think which can survive an election, basically, is to say we are going to go to the European Union, we're going to negotiate a new deal with the European Union, and then potentially campaign against it. It just doesn't make sense to me.
This, look, honestly, it's like it's sort of sunk in, I think, over the last year, that one of the things with Brexit in general is that the content of it matters. It matters that the withdrawal agreement looks like the way it does. It does matter, but it's what you say around all that matters more for a great chunk of people, particularly ones who really think very deeply about what Brexit is and care very greatly about it. It matters whether you're a sort of Leavey person or a Remainy person, right? It's kind of become this weird sort of signifier for a whole load of other things. So the actual specifics of whether Labour is doing X, Y, or Z and the detail of how the negotiation will go and that sort of thing matters less than an indication that this is roughly what we're now going to be looking at, rather than this is what we're roughly going to be looking at. Yeah. So I'm not that fussed on the points of detail, and it's something you can sort out when you get to a manifesto. What matters is your kind of inclination and how you're going to talk about these things. What really matters is that we don't have an election talking all the time about Brexit, when there's a whole range of other issues that we absolutely have to talk about, like climate change, like the state of the economy, the state of public services, and that's where we have to try and get the whole campaign to spread just as it did in 2017 and get out of only talking about Brexit.
I think where I'd slightly disagree there is, and why I think the process matters and that you get the process exactly right, is that if what you want to do is move on to a different topic, what you need is an incredibly short answer.
Yes.
And so if when they're asking you about Brexit, you have a very vague and quite difficult to understand
the answer is quite short,
policy.
Isn't it?
At the moment, if you say we're going to go to the
we'll
European Union,
right? You say to someone, okay, look, to be honest, you can see the doorstep conversation is something like, politicians haven't made too good a job of this. We'll let you have a say in it and sort it out once and for all. That's that. There's your referendum. That's what we'll do.
I just think the idea, and it will happen on TV time and time again when they say, seriously, you're going to go to the European Union, you're going to negotiate a new deal, and then you're going to come back and then you're going to decide whether to campaign against it. That's mad. I just don't think it's going to survive. What I think they should do is put Theresa May's withdrawal agreement against Remain, say we'll do that on day dot, it will become law whichever one wins. That means the Brexit debate is over, the EU debate is over. If we leave, it's not the end of the world, the sky won't fall in, it won't be a no-deal Brexit. If we remain, that'll be fabulous, that's what we're going to campaign for, even though our MPs are allowed to campaign for leave if you want, but there'll be no more negotiations. We want this over, because I think Boris Johnson's line, which is, this is the party, Labour are the party of differing and stalling, is actually quite strong, and I think we want to neutralise that so we can move on to different topics.
It's the one that probably has more cut through than anything else. I mean, people are spitting feathers already, and this is the risk, this sort of parliamentary thing about how we're going to avoid a no deal. Well, it starts to look like, we're just going to have another 3 months or 4 months, whatever it is, of talking about Brexit and shifting the date when it happens and all that sort of thing. And it's like people are spitting feathers, leavers obviously, and people who voted Remain on like this thing dragging on and on and on. I mean, this is like the side effect of Theresa May and the way she sort of handled the whole thing over the last, how long was she in power for? It's like 2 years, 3 years. It's sort of all a bit of a blur.
Flew by.
Which is that it's dull and it was polarising, and it was really like quite toxic the way this thing started to play out, that she was just coming again and again around the same sets of questions. But I mean, people really would like to see this dealt with one way or the other. It may well be that a second referendum is the only way to conclusively deal with it one way or the other. The way to deal with it, I suppose, is revoke or actually just do Brexit, and that's that. But these are not such viable options given the terms on offer at the minute.
Okay, we're going to go through one more thing, but then I'm going to go to questions, which means if you want, you can start typing your questions now so I can collect them while James is answering what I'm going to ask. I don't know what our emoji is today. I think it's now just a rocket forever. So, Gary, if possible, can you get up the Telegraph article? Although we'd probably only be able to see the headline, to be honest, because I don't think that computer has a subscription. I got a free subscription today. So this
you only need the headline, really.
You only need the headline. Yeah, this was under the headline: Corbyn better than no deal Brexit, say investment banks, as anti-capitalist Labour wins unlikely new City fans. And we've got a couple of quotes. So Christian Schultz, an analyst at Citibank, so one of the biggest banks in the City of London, says, a year ago, a Labour government would have been a big economic downside risk. These risks to the longer-term outlook have not changed, but Labour has become more decisively pro-EU over the past 12 months. At the same time, a fiscally profligate no-deal Conservative government is no longer as enticing. David Oliver at Deutsche Bank, so another big bank in the city, says, we see the magnitude of economic damage caused by a no-deal Brexit as much higher than policies proposed in the last Labour manifesto. Are we in a situation now where the City of London want a Jeremy Corbyn government?
That would be, I think, and I say this quite carefully, but I think that would probably be overstating to say they're going to be out campaigning for Jeremy Corbyn. Although you say that, I mean, if you take the Financial Times readership at the last election, the breakdown of their voting was closest to the national polling outcome, right? So they actually got an awful lot of Labour voters who read it, an awful lot of Tory voters who read it, and it roughly worked out as sort of slightly under on Labour, slightly over on Tory. So it's quite striking if you take that as an indicator. And personally, you can think of people who work in the city who vote Labour and want to make a difference there. And there is a minority who do kind of obviously care about society living and think that this would be a good way to try and make things better for people. It is, as John says, you don't want to actually be stepping over homeless people every time you try and walk home. This is not like a pleasant place to live, and you can be wealthy and think it's quite reasonable to pay a bit more in taxes to do that. I mean, that's basically what we asked in 2017. It's almost certainly what we're going to ask this time round. But if you take the institutions of the city, the challenge they face is that it's not a challenge, but they realise that a no-deal Brexit is economically damaging. From their sort of longer-term institutional point of view, almost any version of Brexit doesn't look too great. That once you as a city firm looking to trade in Europe, and most large city firms, one sort or another, do try and do this. It's the biggest kind of financial markets on the planet just sitting next door to you. And the City of London itself acts as a major sort of financial market for the whole of the EU, in addition to its operations as a global centre. It's a big place for people to raise capital for the Eurozone, that kind of thing. Is that once you lose the rights of access that you get as a single market member to those financial markets, every version of Brexit looks kind of not particularly great, right? So over the longer term, everything looks a bit ropey. Once it became clear very, very early on that city firms were not going to be keeping what they call passporting rights, then any version of Brexit starts to look fairly indifferent. What they care about is the sort of immediate economic damage, and on that one, it's pretty clear that a kind of no-deal Brexit will definitely cause problems for the entire economy and potentially for all of Europe, and that's not, if you're a large city firm, something desirable. Now, if you're a hedge fund taking a short position on the pound, or for that matter, possibly in the euro, in other words, you're betting on the thing crashing in value, then you're like, no deal Brexit, bring it on. We're more than happy for this to happen. So there is that section of the city that is much more speculative. These are not, you're not talking about big, solid institutions like Citibank, or I think Deutsche Bank is the other person quoted in the Telegraph. These are much more speculative bits of finance capital. At that point, you'll find people who think no deal Brexit, fine by me, could even do quite well out of it. Thank you very much. But you're into the speculators, you're into the gamblers, you're into the marginal elements of the city here.
And is that the weird sector of capital that is kind of behind Boris Johnson? Because I mean, even besides the whole Brexit policy, it is an administration which seems quite weird. The people from the Adam Smith Institute who sort of go in there, and he's got people from Guido, he's got people from the Taxpayers Alliance. They're not really mainstream British capital, are they? They're quite niche at this point in time.
Jacob Rees-Mogg is a classic example of it. Aside from his kind of public persona, which is the honourable member for the 19th century and Mr. Loosh, sprawling all over the benches in Parliament yesterday to great effect, I think, for Labour's leaflets in the upcoming election. But let's see. He is also like quite a major asset manager, relatively major asset manager, and somebody who trades quite regularly in the city and is completely sort of au fait with global capital and all the rest of it. And occasionally these two things sort of get exposed. There was a business about his asset managers, the name of which I forget, was opening and taking short positions in Ireland relative to the pound, that sort of thing. It's kind of, sometimes the two personas clash, right? He's talking up how great Brexit is whilst simultaneously running what appear to be bets against how Britain's going to do in the future. There was a very good essay by William Davies, the economic sociologist down at Goldsmiths, basically trying to sort of digging this out a bit and saying actually there is this sort of section of that, as you say, slightly weird bit of capital where it's all a bit more speculative, where you're not like particularly interested in the really solid, here you are, classic investment banking stuff, actually quite long-term investment.
Kind of Del Boys, but with more money.
Yeah, basically that sort of end of it, the speculative end of it, the real sort of rentier capitalism, that kind of thing, are quite keen on hard Brexit because they think it's opportunities to make money because they're all about, wriggling your way around whatever laws and regulations might be there, taking short positions on things, being very, very speculative traders, and forming a strange alliance with a whole bunch of other people who also sort of, by this point, this is Will's point anyway, they have large amounts of property here that they don't really need to work. They're not going to be affected too much by the broader ups and downs of the economy in quite the way some of the rest of us are. So they form a kind of happy alliance of people who are quite content with no deal Brexit. Now Will might be overstating this case. I mean, you're getting into a sort of very old school, potentially sort of economic deterministic Marxism at this point, but there is something to that. And you can see it in the Boris Johnson administration that this is not like a Tory administration that appears to have much contact with the major units of British capital. And it does look to me, and the Telegraph has picked up on this in the story here, that large parts of not just British capital in general, but finance capital, banks and other large financial institutions have picked up on this and are much more inclined to deal with a Labour administration that has a halfway sensible economic policy, which is almost anything except no deal Brexit in the short term, and we'll talk to you about the plans for long-term investments, that sort of thing, and talk to you seriously about reforms you might want to make to the financial system. That's been going on for a while, certainly since at least 2017 election, and it's interesting it's playing out like this. This is what I mean by potentially one of the outcomes here is the elimination of the Conservatives as a political force in Britain, in the same way the Liberals disappeared in the 20s and 30s.
To be replaced by whom?
Well, in that case, it'd be replaced
sort of
by
liberal
Labour.
Capital kind of vibe.
Well,
we live in a two-party system, right? So
I mean, look, 20s and 30s, it's not a perfect analogy, but there never is a perfect analogy. But in the 20s and 30s, Liberals disappear, basically replaced by Labour. It takes a long time, and a couple of world wars and other such big things intervene, but that's what you get to. There's no reason to assume a party will be around forever. Right, there's no reason to assume the Tory party, which is the last time we won a really secure majority is 1987. They've had two small majorities since then, but otherwise minority administration at best and out of power. So, and the membership decline has been spectacular. And the increasing reliance on kind of a really weird centralisation of power inside the party and trying to get away from being anything approximating an influence in society because you're centralising power and relying on an institutional weight that you carry through the mass media in particular. There's no reason for this party necessarily to continue if you're also at the same time cutting yourself off from what historically was your role as the political voice of British capitalism. So that would fit in with this kind of slightly odd feel to this administration in terms of who's peopling it, where they're coming from, how they act and how they think about the world.
We've got some questions. So first question, a simple one. This is from Coping Method. Will deep learning plus AI render Gary's role in Navarro redundant? And the answer is no. It will actually liberate Gary to have a far more significant role in Navarro because currently he's chained to that laptop, editing, making up for mistakes, like when I haven't sent him the script, things like that. So AI, I'm a social democrat, but I'm also into the fully automated.
I was about to say this is fully automated.
I'm into the fully automated luxury part, which means that when tasks get automated, we just do more, right? And we do more in a more leisurely way, not necessarily more.
It's good doing more, not bad doing more.
Good doing more, yes. We're not doing more for the sake of it, and obviously nothing at Navarro gets done for the sake of it.
Of course not. So fully automated luxury social democracy.
Pending. So social democracy until potentially if the price mechanism breaks down. This is my position. We have social democracy.
The price
it works
mechanism
quite well.
is breaking down.
Yeah, well, I mean it's managing
We've still got
for a while,
capitalism,
isn't it?
and it's worse than it was before. But okay. It's another discussion.
It's another discussion. I need to go through these questions.
Sorry.
Right. Head Nicker in charge. It was kind of a leading question. You might challenge the assumption. I'm not sure. Is the fact that most people still think austerity was a good or necessary idea a sign of the failure of the Labour communication strategy?
No, they don't. That's not what the polling says, and it hasn't said for at least 2.5 years. Like, it started a shift. You could see it shifting already by about sort of 2015 when the effects started to become apparent. But
is that so there's two questions that get asked in opinion polls, right? One is, do you want the government to increase spending?
Yeah.
And that's really shifted over the last couple of years. And then there'd be a separate question, which would be, do you think austerity in the first place was a good idea? I don't know. Do you know? Have you seen polling on the second question?
The second one shifted as well.
Okay.
And it's shifted. There's also, I think part of it is just the actual impact of austerity is now unavoidable. Like for a long period of time, a lot of people could be basically insulated from it one way or the other. It's now unavoidable, so that's one part. The other part is like we have just argued against this. And had we not done that, you wouldn't now have a government which says we're going to spend £13.8 billion. This is evidence of the thing working.
Thank you for. As an economist, you might know, how much is the Danish kroner worth?
Ooh, that's an interesting. I don't know. Actually.
I got incredibly excited yesterday in the super chat because I thought a very kind Norwegian fella, was donating us £100 a pop.
Right.
So I thought we got 400 quid off this guy, but then it became apparent to me that these were Norwegian kroner.
Okay.
So I mean, it was still very generous. Thank you for your 400 Norwegian kroner, but it comes to much less than 400 English pounds. Navarra Media tells me it comes to £6, which is still brilliant. Thank you for the £6.
£6 nice. Yeah.
Right. Next question. I wanted the question about, I can't find it right now, but it was a question about, should Labour compete with or ally with the Greens and the Lib Dems?
Oh god, the Progressive Alliance. Well, look, the Lib Dems. I mean, they're busy trying to.
You're not allowed
alliances.
to make that noise about my audience's questions.
Oh, sorry, no, I'm not. It's not so much. The question is a reasonable one, but it's just the thought of the Progressive Alliance and all that entails. No, it's not even that. It's the thought of the Lib Dems is what makes me make that noise. And particularly, I'd say under its current leadership, under any leadership after Charles Kennedy, which is what, 3 of them. It looks like this. Look, the reports this week that Joe Swinson's seeking deals with Remain Tories. Right now, look,
it was also Remain Labour people, so actually the headline was slightly misleading.
Yeah, but you're seeking an alliance with Remain Tories. Yeah. Now, there is a fundamental problem here, right? The fundamental problem is austerity was definitely very destructive, and we're going to have to make some big changes to how the economy operates. The Tories are going to say we're ending austerity. It's not going to undo, not by a long way, the damage of the last few years, and they're not going to make changes to the economy, or at least not going to make big changes to the economy that any of us would want to see. So, no, you shouldn't be doing an alliance with them. And this idea of progressive alliance with people who are, up until fairly recently, last few weeks, Joe Swinson was simply saying, no, we can't possibly have a deal with Jeremy Corbyn. No, we'd rather talk to Tories. We'd rather have Ken Clarke, John Major's Chancellor, a cabinet minister under Margaret Thatcher being Prime Minister, than Jeremy Corbyn, someone who stands for like increased public spending, a fairer society, environmental action on the environment, that kind of thing. It just doesn't hold water. It's a different question with the Greens, although the Greens also need to sort out what they're doing. Like spending your time, I don't want to sort of wag my finger at people, or you're going to anyway, spending your time kind of tailing along behind the Lib Dems as like, we're just as keen on Remain as they are, but we're a bit more sort of green and less likely to get elected, doesn't strike me as a particularly good long-term strategy.
I think there's two ways of looking at that question as well. One is, do we have a formal electoral alliance with the Lib Dems? I think the answer is probably no. The other is, do we put a little bit more effort than we currently have done to court liberals? To court people who their identity is as much a liberal one as it is a socialist one.
That's a more interesting question, because the liberals and people identify as liberal is not the same, fortunately, as Lib Dems, right? And often Lib Dems act in a sort of bizarrely unliberal way. I mean, if you look at the voting record of the Tory MP who crossed rather dramatically from Tories to Lib Dems yesterday, whose name completely escapes me, Philip
Lee.
Thank you.
I only learned who he was yesterday as well.
Well, they are. Yeah, well, if you look at his voting record, he's hardly someone who accords with liberal values and a whole load of questions around gay marriage and this sort of thing. So, and the fact that you had the Lib Dems propping up this Tory government for the 5 years that they were there, it's like these things don't really fit very well with a whole load of people who would identify or self-identify as liberals, or broadly say, yes, I support liberal values. So, yes, I think we do need to go out and say, we would like your votes. I think that is, of the set of people who are going to get to vote for us next time round, these are the people who are most likely to be one in our direction. But the fundamental strategic mistake on the Progressive Alliance, or versions of that, like let's have a formal arrangement, is that if you have this big blunderbuss heading towards you, which is the Tory party fired up by Boris Johnson shouting about how they're going to do Brexit and everything's going to be great forever, or whatever the hell the rhetoric is, your response to it should not be running around looking frightened and scraping around trying to find anybody you can to cling on to. The response has to be, okay, that's going to be what you say. We want a radically different society. This is what it's going to look like. And everybody who agrees with us and wants to defend what we've actually won already in the society we live in. So it's defending democracy even. It's defending certainly public services, but it's going beyond that point and saying we could do so much better. Everybody needs to be with us. You don't spend your time running away, looking frightened and saying, oh dear, we might lose. If we'd done that this week, Boris Johnson would not be in the bad situation he is now in. You know, if somebody's a bully, it's exactly as you say. You have to stand up to them. You don't run around trying to look panicked. So I don't think that's going to cut any mustard at all.
My conversions were wrong earlier, which means that I've understated the kind donations from our Norwegian comrade yesterday. So 400 Norwegian kroner, which is what we were given yesterday, is 40 Great British pounds.
Oh, that's much better.
Today, the 50 Danish kroner was £6.
Ah.
Also a brilliant donation. But it's important to get our conversions right, isn't it? Okay, next question. Trans Squidgy. Techno Squidgy. Sorry, but trans is involved in the question, which is why that mistake was made. There are reports that Bojo might try and use trans rights as a culture war issue in campaigning. A scary prospect. Could Labour deal with a Trumpian campaign from Bojo?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, look, I said this before. I said this last time I was on. Because it was during the Conservative leadership campaign. It was like, of the candidates standing, the one I think Labour would most want to face was Boris Johnson. Right, he's the one who's clearest and most obvious about how you beat him. And to be honest with you, looking at the last week or so, I think that was the right call. Let's see where we get to, but I think I was right on this. So yeah, if he wants to run a Trumpian campaign, go for it. I mean, fine by me. If he thinks running trans rights or bigotry against trans people or whatever it is that they're trying to flag up here is going to get him loads of votes, I think it's one, because you can see where they're trying to target it. This was the Times, I think, reporting the thing.
Yeah,
yes.
Rachel Sylvester.
Yes, yeah. It was Rachel Sylvester in a column just sort of touched on it. It's like, look, if they think they can sort of troop off to the north of England, wherever is what do they imagine? You know, that everyone's some sort of knuckle drag. Everyone's like some primitive, just waiting to find some new form of bigotry they can express themselves with. It's patronising claptrap. It's wrong. It's not taking people seriously. It's not understanding what kind of country we live in, how it's changed, how you can go to any part of this country and see that actually those so-called liberal values that we were just talking about and people identify with that are absolutely all over the place. This is not the place it was 20 or 30 years ago where kind of low-level bigotry might cut through. So if you want to do that, well, it's ugly and it's disgusting and we'll combat it, but it's not going to turn out the votes in the way that you think it will. We will have something better to say in this. We will have something better to say in this because when people face by real problems in their lives, public service is not working. The economy, like producing crap jobs forevermore. You can't afford a house. You can't even afford to rent properly. Your high street's nothing but boarded up shops. When you see all these real problems, we will have real solutions to them, not some sort of fake Trumpian so-called culture war. So no, fine. They shouldn't do it. It's disgusting. We'll combat it. But it won't work for them electorally either.
I mean, that links back to something you said earlier, actually, which is that Donald Trump won not because of his rhetoric, but because of his policies. Yeah. So I think a lot of people, and potentially sort of like the liberal centrist analysis of Donald Trump, is that basically Hillary Clinton had better policies, but the people, he appealed to the darkness in people, and people were driven to the polls by their hatred of migrants and gays or trans people or whoever he was directing hate at that particular day. And your argument is it wasn't those things that drove people to the polling booth. It was the fact that Donald Trump actually offered to rebuild a bridge in their community, which is exactly what Jeremy Corbyn is offering, potentially not in such an arbitrary way of pointing at a gap and saying we'll build you a bridge, but in a way where, in a more systematic and structured way, we will reinvest across the country.
Which is partly why Boris Johnson's now trying to get into talking and using this sort of rhetoric. But I mean, look, I don't want to reduce it down to like, hey, we're just going to spend some money and people will like it, and then that's going to be the thing that cuts through this. Like, the rhetoric matters. It matters, particularly in the Trump coalition, is how do you hold together a coalition that looks like some of the richest people in America, which is your basic, average Republican voter is historically and in the last election richer than the American average, right? This is your Republican base. How do you hold that together with some of the poorest people in the country? And one way to jam the thing is that you start to have this America First rhetoric and all the rest attached to that. So it does matter. It holds together your coalition. We have to hold together quite a different coalition. And it has to be on the basis of talking about, we're going to defend what's good in British society. That includes multiculturalism. That includes the idea that we have all sorts of progressive values, that we're tolerant and decent and fair to people, right? You build a coalition around that. You don't build it around some other, whatever version of Blue Labour or something like this might occasionally get presented for us to try and work around. That I don't think will work for us. So you can kind of see, if the election is going to polarise like this, you can see how it's going to end up, and you can see, and I think you're right, that you end up with both parties getting about 40%. And the key bit will be how you campaign, can you get people out in the streets, what is the positive, hopeful message we carry versus whatever Trumpian nightmare thing the Tories managed to summon up by that point.
There were a few questions about Stephen Kinnock's amendment. So we've been live for about an hour, so potentially there's been some updates. But just before we went live, there was a news story whereby Stephen Kinnock proposed, so the motion that we were talking about yesterday and which we've touched upon today, whereby Parliament is going to mandate Boris Johnson to request an extension from the EU and then accept it. Stephen Kinnock had proposed an amendment which would mean that when Boris Johnson requests this extension, it is in order to have Parliament here for a fifth time, I think. Fourth time, the withdrawal agreement. This was, I mean, it didn't get that much attention because most people thought it would fall. What happened in Parliament, it was very odd. This was another part of parliamentary procedure which I've learnt for the first time today, which is that when they vote in Parliament, you have a teller, which is the person who, I suppose, counts the votes or announces the votes. So they had the aye tellers, the yes tellers. So they said, you know, we've got 200 people who voted for it or whatever. I don't know what the number was. The no teller, so the person who's supposed to announce or count the votes of the people who were against the amendment, they didn't turn up. And it seems it wasn't just Theresa May doing something sneaky and volunteering to be the teller and then sort of leaving early to troll Boris Johnson. This was, it turns out, what the government wanted. So the government wanted this amendment to pass. And just before we went live, I wasn't sure exactly what the logic was supposed to be. So I saw that Nick Watt, who is the politics editor at Newsnight, said at 7:52, so a couple of hours ago, here is what happened on Stephen Kinnock amendment, according to source in anti-no deal group. Government deliberately put up tellers to oppose because they knew Labour leadership was also opposed to Kinnock. Hope was that if it went through, Labour would drop support for Bill. Now, to me, that sounds insane. There is no way that when the Labour Party has got the government on the ropes, what they're going to do is say, oh, we're not sure about that amendment, so suddenly we're going to withdraw our support. So, to be honest, if I'm being honest with you, I've got no idea what the manoeuvring here was about. It makes sense from Stephen Kinnock's idea. So what they're hoping is they want all of this to end. I don't know. It always looks a little bit politically odd when you say, oh, we made a massive mistake because we voted against it. But there's about 20 Labour MPs who are saying, when we voted against Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, we made a massive mistake. We feel bad about it. What we want is the withdrawal agreement to come back to Parliament, and we'll vote for it this time. And with 20 Labour rebels, potentially it will pass. So that looks like maybe it will come back. Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose one possibility here, whatever the motives were for this weird parliamentary manoeuvre, is the withdrawal agreement comes back on, say, October the 20th. And then parliamentarians have to decide what to do.
Or the amendment gets struck out in the Lords, which are
so that's another option.
Limited understanding parliamentary procedure. Well, it's not that limited, but not brilliant. I'm no James Butler on these things, but is that's one of the options, or that you just kind of basically ignore the thing and yes, okay, we vote exactly as you say, you vote for it, and then it still doesn't pass. It's not quite the withdrawal agreement as was last voted on. It's the withdrawal agreement with various amendments that are supposed to be protections on workers' rights, environmental protections, that sort of thing. This is the agreement Theresa May got to with a bunch of MPs. So it's not just let's do the same thing again. It's let's do the same thing again with a couple of tweaks. So it's not quite as like bizarre and weird thing to do. But it's not a good situation to get to when you have somebody, and I have to assume it's intentional, messing around with parliamentary procedure like this to try and, I would guess, not so much actually. I mean, maybe it's true that they thought Labour would somehow back off and not, but it just seems.
It does seem
Why
bizarre,
would you do
doesn't
that? It's. I think it's more just like gumming up the process.
Yeah, it might be one of those stories that actually only really lasts 2 hours because everyone realises it was just a weird distraction that doesn't really matter that much. What we're going to do, because I want to end kind of soon, but we've got quite a lot of questions, and I know you're good at quickfire rounds. Okay. We're going to do a quickfire round. So you've got to, I mean, I don't have a timer obviously, but you've got to sort of aim to give me quickish answers to them. So Juliet Jakes asks, how far should Corbyn personally attack Johnson in any campaign, given that he tends to be nice, even too nice to his enemies?
He shouldn't.
Interesting. TWO Tom. Has Brexit been good for UK politics?
No.
Ryan Booker, is there any path to Lexit, or is that completely dead?
Yes, there is, but it's like it would take several leaps to get there at this point in time. You can sort of see a route to it potentially.
Shoada Patrick, did Cummings swear at Corbyn in the corridors last night?
Oh god, there's 4 different versions of what happens here, depending on like which. I think Cat Smith had one version, but it then wasn't quite clear if it was Dominic Cummings.
Well, Cat Smith said we just thought it was a drunk
guy.
Yeah. But then everyone interpreted it, myself including, that she just thought Dominic Cummings was a drunk guy. It was very confusing.
Well, I mean, probably. I mean, he seems to have been wandering around drunk last night, so it's entirely plausible that this happened.
In case you don't have the context watching, there was stories last night that Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's advisor, who we've been referring to many a time tonight, was walking around Parliament and Portcullis House, so the parliamentary estate last night, drunk, shouting at people, and he shouted at Jeremy Corbyn, "Come on, let's have an election," and Jeremy Corbyn was ushered away by his advisors, away from this man who stank of booze and was shouting in very unparliamentary language.
Well, it's fine. Honestly, if he wants to have an election, we should have an election. I mean, if they want to bring the election forward as soon as possible, we are ready to do this, and we should be confident about winning. I think that's the other thing that, talking about when's the time of it, all that, you start to lose this core thing here. If they want to go for an election, we will have an election, and we should be confident that we can win that election. Like, very confident. Boris Johnson is our best opponent. We can win this election.
Hummus with Pitta. This is a good question, actually. Is it eerily quiet in FBPE? First, follow back pro-EUville. What are Mandelson, Tom Watson et al. Planning?
Oh, God, no. Oh, I mean, it's run. I mean, the small side effect of the prorogation, and actually it's been building up a while. It's been. This isn't a very short answer, but since Jeremy Corbyn said, "Hey, let's form a caretaker government," and got really on the front foot about what this is going to look like and how we're going to deal with this, and since the mistake, and it is a mistake, of the prorogation and the impact that's produced, I think people on the more sort of procedural FPPE sort of end of things that have been also put onto the back foot. That politics is moving differently to what they anticipate.
Yeah. So the question there sort of implied that potentially they're away conspiring, but it might just be that they've been outflanked, right? They've become less relevant as people. I mean, you can quite easily argue that these people were not particularly relevant political actors, but they filled a space that had been vacated, and now that the Labour Party have filled it. We've got one about tellers. We've answered that already. Oh, why don't Labour, this is from Ollie Mason, why don't Labour just promise to withdraw Article 50 in an election? Strong, clear and democratic in an election.
Strong, clear and democratic in the election, that will...
No, so the question is, would it be strong, clear and democratic?
Would it be strong, clear?
To withdraw Article 50, or to have in our manifesto that we'll just withdraw Article 50, let's not bother with a second referendum.
The issue there is, I mean, my own feeling in this one is that if you say, look, put it this way, you have one referendum to start the process, and we started the process of Brexit, and then you've got one referendum at the end. You've got to have some way to end the process, and you end it either by saying, okay, we like the process, now we're leaving, or you say, no, we don't like the process, now we changed our minds, or we're not going to do this, we've seen what happens, and then we won't leave. So it kind of makes more democratic sense to have another referendum to confirm or not confirm the process than to simply say, that's it, we're just going to throw the thing away. And also that particular issue, I think, would depend very, very greatly. I mean, there's absolutely no intention of doing this, by the way, from the Labour Party. But when you do that would depend very greatly on what has already happened with Brexit, obviously.
Let's call it a night, I think. Yeah. That was great. Okay, it's always a pleasure having you on the show.
No, thanks for having me.
Obviously, we'll be up all evening working out what's happened to the Kinnock Amendment.
It's all over. As you say, it might well be all over by now. I mean, yesterday's news. But...
And then we've got to work out what happens tomorrow. I'm still not entirely sure. Do you know what's going to happen tomorrow?
It's like 54 hours of Lord's debates or something, isn't it?
Oh, I don't want to watch those. In any case, thank you so much for joining me, James Meadway. Thank you so much for watching. As you know, Tisky Sour Navarro Media is only possible because of your kind donations. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.navarromedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Or if you want to give us a one-off donation as well, because the subscriptions are actually the most important, really, because we need, constant income so we can plan for the future. But some super chats are also great. As ever, we want more people to see this show. So please like this. Please share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. Tweet with the hashtag TiskySour. Keep your comments coming. In any case, I would say I'll see you next week, but I'm not actually entirely sure when I'll see you. So it will definitely be by next week. It will be at the latest next Tuesday, but potentially on Monday. Follow our Twitter and you'll get the notification when we next go live. Good night.